That sound, the chattering burp of Soviet-made guns, should have frozen the line at the Pusan perimeter. It didn't. Word raced through the 1st Cavalry Division, 5th Cavalry Regiment, and the answer was steel hard. Hold the Nakdong River line, fix the crossings, make the next move ours. Motor pools fueled up, radios snapped short call signs. Rifle squads checked their M1 Garands by the glow of red-lensed flashlights. Investigators marked map coordinates, collected brass, and began a typed list so no man would vanish into rumor. America did not answer murder with murder. America answered with memory, planning, and scale. Chaplains drafted letters. Artillery forward observers mapped the NKPA's river routes like chess lines. Pilots in F-51, Mustangs and B-26 Invaders traced choke points they would bomb at first light. The question in every tent was simple. How do we turn horror into momentum? The first answer was logistics. Push ammunition dumps forward, stage LSTs, and rehearse litter evacuations in the dark. A corporal passed a canteen and said, "We hold." In a canvas HQ lit by one bulb, a clerk hammered the casualty roll on a portable typewriter, sweat on his brow, though the night was cool. Across wars, one American voice carried into that night. "Be of good cheer, strong and courageous," a husband and officer had written to his wife in a previous war. The line could have been written for Korea. Men repeated it as they wiped oil from bolts and watched the moon cut the Nakdong into silver bands. Mass killing had not broken the army's spine. It had fused one. Even in grief, the system moved orders. Fuel, spare barrels, rations, maps. A survivor whispered later, "I played dead under my friends and felt their weight keep me alive." And that sentence rode with convoys like a flag. Engineers walked the river edges with tape measures and grease pencils. Truck drivers adjusted tire chains for the steep dust roads. Medics laid out plasma and tagged stretchers with carbon copy slips. Somewhere a sergeant checked a field phone and said, "On my go." The killers at Hill, 303, meant to erase Americans. Instead, they stamped us deeper into the ground we would retake. American power would now answer with something the enemy did not expect: a tide table, a seawall, and ships pointed at an impossible harbour. The bridge from the ravine leads straight to a port city called Incheon, to 261 hulls, 75,000 troops, and ladders clattering on wet concrete. The last thing the enemy heard that night was not a scream but a generator coughing to life, floodlights finding maps, and a staff officer saying, "We move at dawn." Rescuers found a killing ground. Bodies tangled in the ditch, a few stunned survivors, and empty ration tins kicked into the weeds. The number is fixed and awful: 68 murdered outright, 21 wounded, 2 dying soon after rescue. One soldier said, "You could hear the fellows praying, and that line can still silence an entire briefing room." America turned atrocity into evidence and action. Investigators logged times, places, and unit patches. Commanders briefed battalions on what the enemy did and why the next march had to be fast. The question, do we answer barbarity with fear or with speed, had only one American answer. Supply columns pushed up, 2 half-ton trucks grinding mountain switchbacks. Infantry squads checked bandoliers and canteens and moved out by the numbers. Pilots opened fresh target folders and penciled in the next day's strikes. The names from Suncheon spread through tents and cockpits like a current. And because truth travels in this army, the enemy lost the tool they trusted most: secrecy. A young medic from Ohio, sunburned, filthy, still shaking, gave sworn testimony with a Korean child he had shielded standing at his side. They told us to sit. Then they opened up, he said, voice flat, hands still trembling over a metal cup. You can see the gravel dust, smell the powder, hear the flies. But the next smell was diesel and hot steel as the convoys rolled again. The enemy meant Sunshon to end a story. Americans made it a hinge. In regimental CPs, maps were pinned and strings were tightened. Arrows jumped north. Artillery tables updated charges for the air that would cool at night. Quartermasters recorded fuel draws, grease-stained thumbs ticking off columns. Signalmen cleaned the carbon off switchboards, checked headsets, set the clock. The army's strength was not anger alone, but the machine that moves when anger is focused. At night, a chaplain read a letter from a different war. Be of good cheer, strong and courageous, and men nodded in the glow of a Coleman lantern. By dawn, the line stepped off. Rifle bolts snapped shut. An air controller keyed his mic and said, "I have your smoke." Sunshon could not be undone, but it could be answered with speed, discipline, and fire. The road ahead bent toward a name the prisoners whispered in fear, the Tiger, and then toward a harbour most called impossible, but Americans called next. The lesson bit deep. Tell the truth fast, move faster, and make the enemy pay in lost time, lost routes, and lost nerve. Drivers in M35 trucks learned the curves by gear and by smell. Forward observers could plot a culvert by memory, and every man who heard Sunshon carried a private promise: we will not leave our people nameless again. Wayne A. Johnny Johnson, a skinny private with a stub of pencil, hid paper in his rags and secretly wrote the names of 496 dead, so their families would know. The cruelty was meant to erase men. The list turned erasure into memory. Snow blew sideways. Boots bled through at the toes. A guard cracked a rifle butt across a back and laughed. How do you defeat an enemy who thinks terror will wipe out your story? You write the story anyway, even if it kills you. Johnson folded the paper, pressed it to his chest, and whispered, "We keep faith." Another POW, lips split and blue, murmured, "Be of good cheer, strong and courageous," and the words travelled down the line like a shared blanket. At night, men traded crumbs and rumours of rescue, measured the cold by how the canteen lids froze, and counted steps like prayers. The Tiger wanted broken men. He got witnesses. When liberation finally came, the roll call became letters to mothers and wives, proof that their sons did not disappear. American units learned too. Medical teams practiced moving faster with less. Intelligence officers mapped guard habits, routes, and likely execution sites. Logisticians circled passes on acetate overlays and wrote, "Do not lose" in grease pencil. Everywhere the names were read, resolve got sharper. A sergeant promised, "If we ever get the chance, we will cut the enemy's road in one stroke." That chance came sooner than anyone thought. Ships gathered. Marines rehearsed ladder drills on greasy piers. Naval gunfire plotted targets by tide and by minute. The Tiger's road of pain would meet America's road of power at the sea. The guards believed cold and hunger would win. Instead, they had forged the will that makes an army move as one. The roll in Johnny's shirt was America in miniature, names protected by grit and a plan. The plan had a name now. It would ride a 30-foot tide, cross mud like glue, and climb a seawall with bayonets and grapnels. It would land X-Corps, where textbooks said no one could land, and it would flip an entire front like a coin. From a freezing mountain trail to a harbour of fire, the next page belonged to the United States, and the enemy would feel it in every lost depot and every silent radio. The long march had forged a single sentence in American steel. We do not break, we break through. And the name of the breakthrough was Incheon. Operation Chromite hurled roughly 75,000 troops and 261 naval vessels into Incheon in mid-September 1950, severing North Korean supply lines and liberating Seoul in about 2 weeks. The numbers read like fiction until you see the tide charts and the concrete walls. Engineers, Marines of the 1st Marine Division, soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division, and sailors of X-Corps hit narrow windows with wristwatch precision, and the map flipped from near collapse at the Pusan perimeter to pursuit. Naval gunfire from cruisers and destroyers hammered Wulmi-do. Amphibious tractors churned the flats. Shore parties threw up markers while riflemen climbed caving ladders, boots slipping, hands raw. A bosun scribbled one plain line in his notebook. We climbed while the tide ran like a river. This wasn't luck. It was American planning, logistics, and nerve running on all cylinders. Task Force staff rode the clocks. Pilots in F-4U Corsairs and AD Skyraiders rolled in on cue. Pathfinders marked lanes. Marines carried scaling ladders like medieval raiders armed with radios. Seoul fell fast. Convoys then roared forward with rations, ammunition, and 105mm rounds stacked to the truck rails. A young lieutenant counted the pallets and said, "This is how you turn a war." The enemy expected trench warfare. America delivered ocean math and joint power. Behind the assault was a culture of precision. Seabees had timbers cut before orders were signed. Signalmen rehearsed line-of-sight relays on rooftops. Doctors staged plasma stands as if setting a theatre. The city's smell turned from tidal muck to diesel and cordite, then to the sharp breath of winter. A rifleman in the 5th Marines told a friend, "For Hill 303. No one needed to ask what he meant. The enemy's rear was gone, and so was their clock. The road north opened like a gate. There would be new dangers, new mountains, and a river named Yalu where jets would duel. But the shock of Incheon set the rhythm. The United States had shown the world that a free nation can change the shape of a war with brains, boats, and timing, and that revelation set the stage for an even greater feat at the far end of the peninsula, an evacuation that would save an army and a people at Christmas. When the last wave cleared the wall, Marines pushed into alleys where the fight was room to room and stair to stair. By dusk, the beachhead breathed radios crackling, bulldozers clanking, corpsmen calling for stretchers. That sound was the prelude to Seoul and to a promise. We will not be pushed into the sea. We will use the sea to push history the other way. In roughly 2 weeks of December 1950, Sealift pulled out about 105,000 troops, 17,500 vehicles, and 350,000 tons of cargo, and evacuated nearly 98,000 Korean civilians. One ship, the SS Meredith Victory, carried around 14,000 people by herself and delivered 5 babies at sea. That is not a legend. That is what happens when American sea power, planning, and mercy lock together. Piers were mined for demolition even as cranes swung cargo. Harbour Control plotted ship movements with grease pencils on plexiglass. Marines and soldiers loaded by unit chalks, while Navy beachmasters blew whistles and chopped the air with paddles. A petty officer wrote, "Make room," and soldiers stacked packs to clear deck space for families. Engines throbbed under cold black water. The smell was diesel, cordite, kimchi, and fear mellowing into relief. Boats shuttled in and out while artillery covered the final perimeter. The problem looked impossible on paper. Too many people, not enough time, ice, enemy pressure, and a harbour that could become a trap. The American answer was a schedule. Convoys formed. Tugs nudged freighters. Demolition teams wired the piers. Doctors staged aid stations with plasma and blankets. Signalmen called off minutes like metronomes. On the final night, as the last troops stepped onto the final ships, the charges blew and the piers leapt into fire behind them. The harbour turned to sparks and echoes, while the ships moved east into dark water. A baby cried. A Marine grinned for the first time in a week. Someone passed a tin mug of coffee to a grandmother wrapped in a GI blanket. On the Meredith Victory, space was life. No weapons, no cargo, just people standing shoulder to shoulder in a human freight that mattered more than any tonnage. This was competence with a conscience. And the enemy felt it like a lost heartbeat. They did not destroy a retreating army. They watched a free nation rescue one and save a people at the same time. A boatswain's mate squeezed past a stack of rations and said, "Slide down, friend," and a line of strangers shifted as one. On a transport aft deck, a chaplain led a whispered carol, while a destroyer's 5-inch guns spoke in slow, final notes. By dawn, the skyline of Hungnam was only smoke on the horizon, and counting began. Names matched to manifests, units to hulls, families to decks. The ledger of that night was simple and gigantic, and the message to the world even simpler. America brings its people home and brings help with them. F-86 Sabres met MiG-15 seconds over the Yalu and, by discipline and design, ran up a kill ratio that hovered near 8-1. That wasn't luck. It was training pipelines, radar control, maintenance crews who could swap an engine in hours, and tactics that prized energy and altitude like money in the bank. Down below, H-13 Sioux helicopters skimmed ridge lines with litter pods, whispering the new promise of speed to MASH tents, where surgeons worked under canvas and light. How do you beat an enemy who can replace divisions overnight and seems to own the winter? You master the vertical, and you master time. An F-86 driver wrote after landing, "Energy wins," and taxied past crew chiefs who already had panels open. A controller in a radar van tracked blips and said, "Vector 90 left, Angels 30," and 2 Sabres rolled to, meet them like hammer and anvil. A corpsman at a forward aid station strapped a wounded corporal into a pod and slapped the frame twice. The pilot lifted, and minutes later, the patient rolled into a MASH, where a surgeon clipped a clamp and said, "He's got a chance." The sounds were new: jet howl, rotor wash, suction hiss, the click of surgical hemostats. The numbers were new, too: faster evacuation, forward surgery, shock control, and survival that leapt because distance and time shrank. Combat medicine turned from grim arithmetic into a rescue machine. Every save sent a message up the chain that training and tech were paying off together. Every downed MiG sent the same message to the other side. Pilots in quilted suits learned to pick their fights. When the merge looked wrong, they climbed, reset, returned. MiG Alley became less a place than a pattern. We chose the terms, we kept the high ground, and we left the enemy guessing. On the ground, the tents of a mobile army surgical hospital looked fragile, but inside, the discipline was iron. Plasma hung from improvised racks. Anesthetists counted breaths. Clerks logged cases with pencils because the generator sometimes coughed. A young surgeon taped a photo of his kids to the lamp and said, "Next," and the team moved like a drill team with scalpels. The enemy tried to grind us down by cold and shock. Instead, Americans turned minutes into lives. Air superiority bled into mercy. Machines and values fused into one system. The next turn would widen the lens to the full American machine ports built overnight. depots that could feed an army, and a coalition that held because America made room for everyone to win. After Incheon, Seabees and Army engineers reopened Kimpo Airfield under fire, rolled pierced steel planking across shell-torn ground, and had transport aircraft landing while smoke still hung over the Han. Bulldozers idled beside stacked PSP, fuel bladders, and timber piles. The smell was hot oil and brine. Shore parties marked lanes, cranes swung pallets, and forklifts darted between piles of 105mm rounds, sea rations, and medical crates. Marines called the clanking tracked loaders hog wallows, and no one complained when those hogs made roads where maps showed none. The revelation was simple and devastating. America didn't just fight on battlefields, it built them. Where another army saw a closed port, Americans saw a timetable. Where another staff saw impossible. Our logistics officers wrote windows and tides. Engineers threw Bailey bridges across streams that had no names on the map. Seabees sank pilings, lashed trestles, and turned Walmidoo's shattered edges into working berths. In the alleys of Seoul, signalmen ran wire over rooftops to create instant command nets. A corporal in a dump yard painted big block letters ammo, water, MED on scrap board so drivers could find what mattered in the dark. The human element stood in scuffed boots and a salt-white cap. Piers up by Tuesday, tell the pilots they've got a runway, a construction chief said, then grabbed a sledge and led the swing. A young lieutenant in the 7th Infantry Division rubbed grease off his hands and wrote home, "It looks like a city growing in hours." Another GI grinned over a mug of burned coffee and said, "We're building the road we're about to race on." The enemy's shock came as a calendar error that never corrected. Depots they thought denied were dumping cargo. Airfields they believed unusable were launching fighters and medevacs. Attacks timed to tide or darkness found Americans already there. Lights hooded, forklifts whispering, guards posted. The noise of cranes and generators meant the front could jump again. Bridge to what's next. The machine isn't just steel and timber, it's people, allies, and a code. As ports roared and runways glittered with landing lights, new flags joined ours at the line of departure. 17 nations sent combat units, more sent medical teams and ships. A GI taped a Korean child's mittens to his parka so he wouldn't lose them in the wind. "Make room," someone said, and a whole formation shifted. The next chapter opens that lens wide. Coalition muscle shaped and led by American planning, proof that freedom fights as a team, and America knows how to make the team win. On a ridge near Suwon, a South Korean private shared a can of peaches with a sergeant from Kansas, while a British radio operator keyed a contact report and a Turkish patrol checked the wire. The foxhole smelled like mud, peaches, and cordite. American advisors translated fire plans as if they'd grown up in 3 languages. Shoulder patches differed. The map grid and the mission were the same. The revelation landed with a problem. Could a coalition this varied move at American speed? The answer was yes, because we built the lanes for everyone. American transport wings lifted Allied battalions forward. Our depots stocked parts for foreign rifles and radios. Liaison teams married artillery to maneuver with a clarity that turned many tongues into one order. Medical teams took whoever came through the flap. Casualty tags didn't list nationality any larger than they listed blood type. The human element had names, ranks, and habits that made the foxhole warmer. A Republic of Korea lieutenant learned to call for an airstrike by speaking into a US handset and tapping the map with his knuckle. Twice, for emphasis, An Ethiopian captain traded stories with Marines about mountain passes. A British sergeant called the American DUKW a lorry that swims, and laughed as it churned past in the surf. A chaplain from the 1st Cavalry Division found a translator so he could say a prayer that every man understood. The enemy's shock came when probing attacks found not a seam but a weld, positions held because each sector could borrow strength from the next. American supply lines fed Allied brigades as smoothly as they fed our own. A counterattack rolled because Allied tanks and American artillery read the same clock. Radio nets that began the war as islands became a continent of signal, bridge to what's next. Coalition power is one face of American excellence. The other is the way we treat the wounded and the captive. Rumor ran through the ranks about a priest who gave away his gloves and pulled men from death with a smile and a prayer. In a camp far to the north, where winter gnawed at the bone, a chaplain bent rules for mercy and taught men to resist with kindness. The next chapter walks into that yard of ice and shows how American values beat indoctrination and how one man's courage outshone the cold. The snow blew sideways through gaps in the huts at Pyeongtaung. Frost whiskers grew on lips. Guards barked orders and tried to trade food for confessions. The prisoners formed a quiet school, instead teaching each other, sharing signals, refusing the scripted lies. The code was simple: share, pray if you want, never let another man eat alone. The revelation came with a problem. Could faith and fellowship outlast hunger and pressure? The answer was yes, because values travel with you even when boots and blankets do not. The chaplain moved through the yard like a lantern with no flame, warming men by presence alone. He fixed a broken wire in a buddy's shoe, slipped extra food to a man coughing blood, blessed the dead, and smiled at the living. "Don't lose heart," he told a kid from Texas, and the kid, shaking, answered, "Yes, Father," and stood taller. The human element was not only the chaplain. A POW named Johnny folded a roll of names under his shirt so mothers would know who didn't come home. Another man, gaunt as a fence rail, performed a joke with a stick and a tin can, and the yard laughed for the first time in weeks. A corporal who wanted to sign a false confession for soup was talked out of it by a buddy who handed him half a potato and said, "Eat this instead." The enemy's shock came when re-education produced not informers but brothers. Men who were supposed to accuse each other quietly shared strength. Guards learned that denying Bibles did not kill prayer. The winter they hoped would break the Americans instead turned them into a wall that did not crack. When the chaplain finally collapsed, men carried him as if he weighed nothing and whispered the only eulogy they had breath for. "Thank you. Bridge to what's next." That same spirit values turned into action ran along the supply roads, across the waves, and up into the thin air where jets hunted. The United States had mastered more than morale. We mastered the vertical and bent the clock with helicopters and tents of light, where surgeons wrestled with time and won. We have felt the heart. Now feel the engine as it roars at full. The next chapter trades snow for noise and shows how American steel, fuel, and math built a battlefield in hours and kept it fed for months. At Hungnam alone in December 1950, ships lifted roughly 105,000 troops, 17,500 vehicles, and 350,000 tons of cargo, plus nearly 98,000 civilians, while combat units held a shrinking ring of fire. One freighter, the Meredith Victory, took about 14,000 souls aboard and delivered 5 babies at sea. That wasn't a lucky break. It was a plan that treated minutes like gold. Schedules were weapons. The revelation framed the problem. How do you make steel and ocean obey a clock? You write a dockside ballet. Harbour control chalked hull numbers and ETDs on plexiglass boards. Tugs nosed giants into lanes on whispers of throttle. Beachmasters chopped the air with paddles while cranes swung cargo through snow and smoke. Forklifts beeped like metronomes. Demolition teams wired the piers even as they were still loading. The human element walked with a clipboard and a whistle and a heart for people. A boatswain's mate squeezed along a lifeline and said, "Slide down, friend," and 100 strangers shifted together so one more family could climb aboard. A marine captain ordered his company to stack rifles on the deck to make space. Then stood watch with empty hands and full eyes. A Navy corpsman poured hot coffee into a shivering grandmother's tin cup and tucked a GI blanket under a baby's chin. The enemy's shock was a silence that followed their artillery salvos. Nothing they fired could stop the tide of hulls. The piers vanished in one great sheet of fire, and the ships were already grey smudges on the horizon. What should have been a trophy became a story of rescue that circled the earth. Bridge to what's next. Those numbers weren't a one-off. They were the signature of a nation that could refuel a fleet, rebuild an airfield, and restock an army in the time it takes others to hold a meeting. Add the sky to that engine Sabres with a near 8-1 record over MiGs, radar control, maintenance miracles, and you feel the next chapter rising like jet thrust. The payoffs are about to stack. Air mastery, surgical speed, and an alliance that refused to crack. Pilots called it MiG Alley. Controllers vectored flights with cool voices from radar vans. Crew chiefs swapped engines like pit crews, tools tapping in cold metal rhythms. Up high, Sabres kept energy and altitude like money in a bank. Down low, H-13 Sioux helicopters skimmed ridgelines with litter pods, delivering the wounded to tents of light where scalpels flashed. The revelation tightened into a single idea: victory loves speed. A jet that chooses the fight wins. A patient who reaches the knife lives. An F-86 driver taxied in and wrote, "Energy wins," in block letters in his log. A surgeon clipped a clamp and said, "He's got a chance," and handed off to recovery. Radios hummed, generators coughed. The system, from blip to bandage, moved. The human element had grease on his knuckles and frost on his lashes. A crew chief slapped an engine cowl shut and thumbed up a pilot he called Kid, then jogged to preheat the next bird. A nurse at a MASH counted breaths with 2 fingers on a wrist and whispered, "Stay with me," to a corporal whose boots were still crusted with snow. A radar tech traced a finger across the scope and said, "Vector 90 left," and smiled when the returns merged and only one came out. The enemy's shock lived in the way MiGs began to avoid fights they didn't start, and in the way ambushes on the ground no longer removed Americans from the war. A wounded man used to mean a ghost in the order of battle. Now it meant a helicopter shadow and a second chance. Doctrine bent to new facts. Confidence hardened. Bridge to what's next. Add all of it together: ports that wake overnight, runways that appear under fire, an air force that decides the merge, a medical system that pulls men back from the edge, and a coalition that fights as one and asks the final question. What happens when a nation that answers massacre with memory and math decides to build not just a safe withdrawal, but a future? The last chapter closes the circle. From a ravine of death to a republic alive with light and an alliance that still keeps watch. Start in the ravine at Hill 303. Hear the guns. Feel the dust. Then step onto a steel deck crowded with families, into a helicopter beating the cold air toward a MASH, into a jet rolling toward MiG Alley, into a port that roars awake at midnight. Connect the dots, and you see something rare, a nation that could rescue an army and a city at Christmas, take back a capital with tide math and teach battlefield medicine that rewrote survival, then stand guard long enough for a partner to thrive. The revelation asks the last problem. Why did this work when so much said it wouldn't? Because America fused values and power at every turn. We wrote names so the dead were not erased. We landed where charts said no. We lifted whole neighborhoods into hope. We kept the high ground in the air and in our hearts. We built the battlefield, then built a peace worth defending. The human element stands at a memorial near Wayeguan, an old soldier running his fingers over carved names. We didn't just survive, he says, voice rough but steady. We built something the killers could never imagine. A Korean grandfather beside him nods and introduces his granddaughter, who was born in a city bright with neon and free elections, a city that exists because strangers made room on a dark sea. The enemy's shock is history's verdict. Attempts to break American will forged it. Attempts to starve prisoners created witnesses. Attempts to trap a core cut into an evacuation legend. Where fear tried to write the story, Americans wrote it instead. Bridge to a standing ovation. Count what counts. 41 murdered on Hill 303, never forgotten. 68 at Suncheon, named and honored. 700 on the Tigers Road, 262 returning. 496 recorded by a private who would not stop writing. 75,261 ships at Incheon. 105,000 troops and nearly 98,000 civilians lifted from Hungnam, a near 8-1 score over MiGs. The United States did not boast those numbers. It bore them, and it still bears the watch.